Hi everybody, welcome to the second last lecture for the module. It's been quite a ride. Today we're going to be taking on the topic ethics, education and the body. And that topic could have multiple interpretations, so specifically we're going to focus on corporal punishment, gender fluidity in schools and also racial discrimination, as these issues are constantly coming up in our schools. To start, I'm going to spend 3 slides offering an ethical argument against corporal punishment. As I'm sure you're all aware, it's illegal, but still widespread. We'll then spend a bit of time looking at 2 issues that are also widespread in South African schools. The first is about the enforcement or deconstruction of traditional gender norms. And the second is the discrimination based on race and ethnicity that is so prevalent, not just in wealthy schools, but across the board. I'm going to do this by setting up the idea of bodily autonomy. That is the idea that our bodies are our own and that we can mount an ethical defense that no one should do things to our bodies that we don't want them to, even when we're young. That also extends to how we curate, dress, move, and express our bodies, which throws up some interesting questions for things like school uniform and hair policy. But also the fact that we do not choose the bodies into which we are born suggests that being discriminated against because of our bodies is necessarily deeply unethical. Let's go. All right, here is the promised slide about corporal punishment from an ethical perspective. Now, I hope you all know by now that there is an Abolition of Corporal Punishment Act which prohibits the use of corporal punishment not only in schools but across multiple institutions. This has recently caused quite a controversy. In 2019, the Constitutional Court ruled that corporal punishment should not even be practiced in the home. Parents claimed that it was their right to discipline their child however they choose, and some conservative religious figures claimed that corporal punishment is condoned in the Bible and hence not immoral. So South Africans, in the main, seem to believe that corporal punishment is okay. This is an interesting example where social consensus might not necessarily give us the best direction for ethics. So the legal codified approach to corporal punishment is clear. It may not be done. But what about the ethical side of it? I mean, after all, I've spent so much time convincing you that what the law says doesn't always give us what is right. So how can we think through this with the tools that we've built up over these sessions? I'm going to offer my own take on it by engaging a personal reflection of how I've ended up with the stance I have. And I'll encourage you to do the same. Personally, I was raised in a home where corporal punishment was used. For a long time, I believed that it had done me no harm, and in fact, had imbibed the beliefs that my parents had shared with me that corporal punishment had made me a disciplined person. But as I've grown to have a great awareness of psychology, I've changed my mind. Many of the problems that I personally have experienced as an adult echo the longitudinal studies of what happens to children who are subject to corporal punishment. Some of the findings from these studies include problems with intimacy and trust, low self-esteem, a higher likelihood of using physical violence on others as a means of expressional control, difficulty holding emotional and physical boundaries in place, and that people who have been subject to corporal punishment as children have a higher likelihood of ending up in unhealthy adult relationships with people who mistreat them. These are the outcomes of results of decades of tracking children into adulthood and have been subject to rigorous peer review. The findings are pretty damning. Corporal punishment not only doesn't work, but it harms children and minors in significant ways that reach deep into their adult lives. In fact, I've come to think it's a bit of a bizarre thing. We're surprised when adults in South Africa use violence to get what they want, and yet we simultaneously seem to think it's all right for an adult to use pain to get what they want out of a child. Children are just adults in the making. We hurt children for doing something we don't like, and yet we express shock at child on child violence in our schools. And there's a lot of it. All that violent children are really doing is blindly mimicking the behavior of the adults around them. It's also a strange and bizarre expectation that we tell our children no adult may hurt them, no adult may do things to their body that they are uncomfortable with, and we do this in attempts to make our children aware of sexual predators, for example. And yet, the adults that we want them to trust the most, namely their primary caregivers, are allowed to hurt them against their will and with no question asked, all in the name of discipline. I think we need to call a spade a spade. Corporal punishment is the use of the fear of pain or actual pain to get a child to do what we want them to do. Now, even if what we want them to do is good for them, we are still using pain to get there. There's no getting away from it. Physical discipline requires the use of force to induce pain or the threat of pain. We do now know that people who are subject to corporal punishment as children seek out partners who imitate or echo the relations of care they experienced with their primary caregivers. That girls in particular who are beaten or smacked as children are far more likely to gravitate towards abusive partners than those who are not. And in addition, let's be honest, especially those of us who were subject to corporal punishment as kids, children who are beaten or smacked or have fear or pain based discipline strategies applied to them don't stop doing the things they shouldn't do. They just hide it from their caregivers, which can become a real problem when bad consequences happen and the child is too afraid to ask for help. I've a mind to remember a child that I was once talking to who had behaved in an atrocious way at the school when I was a former teacher. And when I asked him what should be done in order to remedy the situation, he replied, "Miss, you should beat me," which I was shocked at. And I said to him, "Have you been beaten before?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Has it stopped you doing things you shouldn't do?" He said, "No." So I asked him, "Does it work?" And you could see the cognitive conflict kicking in. So children don't stop doing the things they shouldn't do, except when they've done something they shouldn't. They don't tell their caregivers, they don't ask for help. And the lack of trust means that confessing a mistake or an error of judgment to an adult is too risky. And so children become vulnerable to those who would prey on them as one mistake becomes two, two become three, three become four. And children are afraid to speak out for fear of the consequences. Now, the people in the family I grew up in still believe in corporal punishment, although I now do not. One of the arguments I'm often given is, well, I was beaten as a kid and I've turned out fine. I'm not sure that a large adult who has no problem hurting a person smaller and weaker than them, or who depends on them for care, food, shelter, is fine. I'd like to trouble that conception of fine. The relation between adults and children is one of dependency. The child cannot escape their need of you. That you might then use pain to control them, I would argue, is unkind, not fine. But like the responsibility accountability issue that we discussed in session 4, sometimes being against corporal punishment is collapsed into being against any form of discipline at all. And so we must, as Bista did, be clear what is meant by discipline if we are to distinguish it from corporal punishment. Personally, I'm not against discipline. I am against discipline through pain and the violation of a child's bodily autonomy. As a little sidebar, I think it's really interesting how many people who are pro-corporal punishment are against food deprivation as a form of punishment. So the same person will be all right with hitting a child, but not making a child skip a meal. Now, I personally don't agree with either. I think both are unkind. But to be okay with one as tough love and denounce the other as cruel is really confusing, since both forms of punishment subject a child's body to something unpleasant. I think an ethical approach to discipline must start with the recognition of the child as a whole human being who is capable of appreciating cause and consequence, boundaries and reason, and who has a right to not have their body compromised or hurt. And besides which, any child not capable of appreciating cause or consequence should definitely not be subject to physical discipline, as they are unable to understand why they are being hurt. Children aren't stupid, they just don't understand all the factors at play. They are unaware of risks, and they are often impulsive, and they have not yet developed self control or self awareness. So I would argue that healthy discipline involves allowing them to explore the world safely while taking measured risks and experiencing limited fallout for the mistakes that they make so that they can learn from them. Now, all the while having an adult that they trust, that they can turn to in times of error or uncertainty to counsel them through their decisions and choices. That implies recognizing the child as a whole other. Do you remember Bauman and proximity? And to not see them as less than human because of their stage of development. You know, it's not a coincidence that many forms of sexism and racism involve treating adults like children. So, as a teacher, my students knew me as a tough disciplinarian, and I would make my expectations very clear. I would communicate boundaries and consequences, and then consistently follow through, whether that was revoking privileges, staying after school to help with tasks, or finishing complete work, whatever it was. But it was always accompanied by a conversation in which the child had to be a full participant. And that would include a discussion of what happened, why, what it was not all right, what alternatives were possible, and what did the child think they could try next time for a better outcome, and what support they needed to get there. Now, for me, this is critical to the ethics of care I must show my children and my students. So I'm going to blow my own trumpet here. I had better behaved students than most of my colleagues who used corporal punishment. I never had to hurt a child to get the classroom under control, and moreover, my students would indeed come and talk, especially about the difficult things, because they felt safe and there was trust. Safety is a fundamental bedrock of learning, because scared children do not suspend their fears and anxieties when the books come out. For me, making sure that my students felt safe and that I was at the helm steering the ship, and hence they didn't need to worry about what was going to happen, meant that I could construct learning moments and sustain a classroom without fear, much more conducive to knowledge and education. If we can implement healthy discipline and guidance without hurting children, well, then I don't think there's an ethical justification that we should hurt them. That's my own perspective, that there's little to be gained from corporal punishment, but much to be lost. For me, I think it's a no-brainer. I invite you now to sit and think for a little bit about your own experiences of corporal punishment. I apologize if that invokes uncomfortable, painful memories for you. What has informed your perspectives about corporal punishment? And what role does an ethics of care play in your beliefs? It's a meta moment here because I think it's more ethical to engage you about the ethics of corporal punishment than to revert to the code or law that just says, don't do it, don't do it. I think I'm more likely to convince you of the downsides to corporal punishment in this way than just by taking recourse in the law and assuming the moral upper hand. So ethics about how to gauge with ethics starts getting a little bit meta. Discussing corporal punishment segues into our next two topics quite neatly. Because really what we're getting at here is the child as a full human, albeit one still in development. I mean, after all, we are all works in progress. I really like the comedian Dylan Moran who said, we're not adults, we're all just tall children with beers in our hands. But on a less humorous note, as fully autonomous humans who are honestly often infuriating and even more often in need of guidance, we still need to respect children and that their bodies are theirs, their own, and don't belong to anyone else. And it would follow from that basis that our students should have a right to express themselves as they feel is authentic to them, including their gender and sexual identities, and not to be subject to any form of discrimination because of the body they were born into. I mean, it's hardly their choice after all. We're going to look at each of these two ideas in turn, and then we're going to round off with some tricky questions about school uniform. There's been a quiet shift brewing in schools that has not had much media attention, perhaps not as much as it deserves. The shift is around the deconstruction of traditional gender binaries, which do not encapsulate the full spectrum of biological or social expressions of sex and gender. Time for a few definitions, and I apologize, these are far from precise or comprehensive. I'm sure the gender students in the audience could define these far better than I. But we'll need some little light touch working definitions for the ideas that we're going to talk about now. For example, a person's sex is how they biologically present as male, female, or intersexed based on the phenotypical manifestation of their genitalia. Now, if you go online and research, you'll find that a significant proportion of the human population is born with a body that fits neither a purely male or purely female format. Now, that's a person's sex, and it's based on their genes, how those genes are coded and expressed. Then there's a person's gender, which is how they express a social identity in line with or against constructions of maleness or femaleness as normative definitions. And those ideas about what being male should be or what being female should be is often about how we walk, how we talk, how we dress, the activities that should interest us, the colors we should like. And there's absolutely nothing about our bodies that prescribes those. Those are social constructions that have been reinforced and entrenched through cultural practices, including artifacts such as movies, music, videos, photographs, etc. And I think that gender is really easy to spot because there's a little bit of maleness and femaleness in all of us if we really think about it. I grew up in a family of women who were involved in very male practices. My grandmother was a bricklayer, and there's absolutely nothing about being female that means one can't be a bricklayer. But as soon as people hear your grandmother was a what, it's because it defies a gender stereotype about what women should and shouldn't be. Another lovely example that I'd like to share is on recent trip to a car garage that was exhibiting classic cars restored from previous eras. The showman and owner of the workshop proudly showed this incredibly elaborate and very, very beautiful classic car that all the mostly men in the room were absolutely bedazzled by. And I couldn't hide the smile on my face when he then introduced the person who had restored this car part by part. Was a woman from Zimbabwe who had formerly worked as the cleaner. And over 10 years, she had restored this beautiful Jaguar, piece by piece. You could have seen the men's jaws drop. Again, gender, that women don't find interesting cars or don't know how to work with cars, is not any way biologically coded. It's just an assumption that we make that is not premised on any basis in fact. Finally, the last definition is sexuality, how the sex and gender of the person or people one is attracted to relates to one's own sex and gender. So, sex and gender are characteristics or properties of a particular person, whereas sexuality is about the relations between two or more people. Now, the term queer has often been used to refer to any identity that doesn't fit a heteronormative gender binary of just male, just female, and attracted to the opposite. Once it was a pejorative, but the LGBTQ community has reclaimed the term as an umbrella term to refer to any non-conventional gender and or sexual alignments, or to even refer to someone who does not want to be labeled. Although you may now figured out that the LGBTQ community are often at the vanguard of playing with words and inventing new terms, I would recommend the YouTube channel of ContraPoints, who is a trans philosophy student turned YouTuber, makes the most beautifully visually amazing explainer videos of complex social and philosophical ideas, including transgender. So if you're not sure about this stuff and you want a little bit more background and understanding, check out ContraPoints on YouTube. More and more, the world is relearning that the idea that everyone is born with a fixed sex or pure male, pure female, that their social genders must align with this, is a pretty incorrect notion. And I say relearning because there's ample evidence that multiple cultures across the world realized that queer identities were not only normal and known, but accepted or even valorized in times gone past. Unfortunately, the idea that every learner is pure male and pure female is really, really entrenched in our schools. This is through things like bathroom infrastructure, through hair policies, through uniform policies, through sporting practices. I mean, as a girl, I never even got the option to play cricket as much as I wished to. Unfortunately, the most reinforcing behavior is how teachers and students treat gender non-conforming students. And that's despite ample scientific, psychological, and sociological evidence to the contrary. In February of 2020, a mother contacted the Mitchell's Plain Education Forum asking advice on how to respond to a school who were intimidating and marginalizing her gender non-conforming teenage child. The student's own response in the face of being called names, being bullied, removed from class, being made fun of by teachers and students alike. The student was remarkable. The student came to challenge school leadership about the issue. And they had to draw on uniform codes and gender non-binary hair policies from other schools to persuade the school governing body that queer students are not just this abomination or anomaly, but in fact they are everywhere and deserve to be made for allowance without being persecuted. There is a draft set of regulations from the Western Cape Education Department for how schools should cater for gender non-conforming students, which is Provincial Gazette 8223, and it's in the Vula Resources folder. And this is a step in the right direction to start shifting the dialogue, but as a code, it cannot supplement for an ethics of care towards such students. How does an ethical imagination look when considering students' bodily autonomy and that they might express or identify themselves in non-conforming ways? Let's address the elephant in the room. Look, for those of us whose beliefs don't take issue with LGBTQI people or who are LGBTQI ourselves, engaging in intellectual rigor, public engagement, and an ethics of care towards such students is not particularly a thorny issue. The difficulty comes in when a belief system we hold, perhaps even our religious beliefs, puts us at odds with each other. This question goes to the heart of one of the biggest debates of moral philosophy. Is there a higher universal ethical imperative, one that we could use to adjudicate when our own beliefs might dispose us towards behaving in ways that are not right or good by others' standards? This is not about laws, this is not about legal frameworks or policies. This is about trying to find some base principle of goodness on which we can rest all our others. Now, several theorists have tried this. Amartya Sen, for example, utilized the concept of human flourishing as the base normative ideal. Others have used concepts such as freedom or liberty. But if we step back from the LGBTQ conversation, we can notice that what's really at stake here is whether our personal notion of what is good and right allows us to act in a way that limits the rights of others. The same issue might arise, for example, if a doctor with a particular conviction decides whether they will or will not perform abortions. But what we're wrestling with is the limits of our notions of right and good, especially notions that we premise on absolute principles and whether we can impose them on others. Is there a way out of this knot? For my part, I think there is a higher good that we can recourse to in such issues. And that higher good is the idea of the flourishing of another human being and the full expression of their total self and their freedom to be their authentic selves, especially when the exercise of that freedom and expression in no way detracts from the freedom and authenticity of anyone else. We'll see later in the discussion on race that there are limits to people's freedom to be their authentic selves if, when they exercise that freedom, they dehumanize or constrain others. Your authentic self might be racist. That doesn't make it okay to be your full authentic self So I personally don't think anyone being LGBTQI detracts from other people's humanity, but that denying or oppressing their LGBTQI status diminishes their full humanity. So in essence, I'm arguing there's a base ideal that we can revert to about how any action or behavior by someone that diminishes someone else's humanity can be incontrovertibly described as not good. And that's often referred to as the principle of equal moral worth, that we are all humans and all deserve equal consideration and equal amounts of care. Now, in this case, the Constitution accords with my own personal ethics. But we've already seen that the law is not sufficient for these arguments. I'd recommend Adam Small's poem, What About the Law? And of course, this line works fine for me because I don't personally think that two informed and consensual adults can have any particularly immoral behavior between them as long as it's negotiated without power or coercion, even though I know others wouldn't agree with me. I also don't think I have the right to impose my view on others if they do disagree with me, even though I might try and convince them of my position. So the principle I turn to regarding a student in my care towards whom I must ethically behave is one of maximizing their full humanity, whether that is based on a gender question they have, on a sexuality question they have, and to make sure that their humanity is maximized irrespective of their ethnicity or race. If that includes assisting a student to embrace a non-conforming identity, that I should exercise my ethical imagination towards that end, so far as it doesn't impinge on the humanity of others. But the practical stuff. If you are a person who holds a belief about LGBTQI that is different to the one I've outlined here, I would advise the following. If your beliefs are irreconcilable with the Constitution and the student's desires and experiences, ask for a colleague to step in and assist. I really would not recommend acting on some personal moral imperative of changing a student's mind or attempting to convince them that their feelings or experiences are wrong. Not only is the law clear on it, but it's important rather ethically to recognize that the principle that protects their freedom to be themselves also protects your freedom to be who you are. That the limitation on imposing beliefs in ways that inhibits the freedoms of others applies to you too. So that is, if you enjoy being allowed to be who you are without interference, you must allow the same for others. At the end of the day, bodies are their own. They do with their bodies and how they feel and understand in their own bodies. That's really for them to decide. And like heteronormative straight people, the limits of what anyone can do with their body and another person's body is about communication and consent. And of course, being able to consent, which most minors are legally defined as not yet able to do. But it's rather about two adults consenting, and this particularly applies to high school teachers regarding relations between students, rather than the rules. Talk about students with consent. Explain to them why minors are not judged as able to fully appreciate consequences and consent, rather than just telling them don't do it. Because as we discussed before, that hardly stops anyone from doing anything. That society has at times told some of us that our bodies are not okay or not welcome is, I think, arguably unkind and unethical. And that leads us to the last part of this section, which is discrimination based on race and ethnicity. Let's talk about race, baby. And yes, I am giving away my age here. There has been an increased attention paid to issues of racism, both individual and systematic in schools. And for those who are not yet aware of the subtle distinction, racial and ethnic discrimination at the individual level is about a particular person behaving in a way that demeans or degrades the humanity of another person based on their race or ethnicity. And that can include calling them by derogatory names, mocking their appearance, including hair, accent, or dress, or being physically violent towards them, or passively excluding them from opportunities and participation in full social life. However, we'll talk a little bit later about the difference between being racist and being just mean. However, racial and ethnic discrimination at a structural level is about systems and cultures that routinely and predictably dehumanize certain groups of people in predictable patterns. Now, historically and currently, this is almost exclusively towards Black people or people of color, people not of European descent, including xenophobia. For example, in the wake of SARS-CoV-2, there's been an awful amount of violence against Asian people or people of Asian presentation in the United States recently, for example. Forms of discrimination of people of Arabic descent, which is often bundled under Islamophobia, although it's not quite the same thing, is also unfortunately fairly common, especially in the wake of 9/11 and the supposed war on terror, as well as forms of xenophobia, which South Africans are all too familiar with, which discriminate on people's culture and language of origin, even if they are the same supposed race. Now, disentangling the two, individual versus systemic, is not easy, because most individual acts of prejudice or demeaning behavior toward people of certain racial ethnic groups are rooted in long-standing histories of violence, systemic dispossession and displacement, structural exclusion from opportunities to access education, employment, etc., and just fundamental dehumanization. That is, that individual acts of discrimination, they don't just pop out of random at nowhere. They don't just kind of happen like some kind of bizarre event in the ether. They are manifestations of broad social trends of subjugation and dehumanization of certain subgroups of the population. I think this is what made the George Floyd moment particularly noteworthy, because like the civil rights movements of the US in the 1960s, there were connections made between individual acts by certain individuals and systemic issues. And that wasn't just by analysts and activists, but it was part of the broader discourse. It's the lack of that connection between specific events and systemic issues that mean other individual acts of racism don't get taken up with the same fervor. I'll give you some examples. The murder of Collins Kossa in 10th of April 2020, Trayvon Martin, 26 February 2012, Ahmaud Arbery, 23 February 2020, Andries Tatane, 13 April 2011, the Marikana massacre of 2012, etc. Because these individual acts are not being traced to systemic issues in our broader conversations, they are not being picked up with the same fervor, even though their families and communities continue to demand justice to this day. They seem like random acts of violence rather than symptoms of a broader problem. Now, racial and ethnic prejudice is basically a form of discriminating against another person because of the body they were born into, and where that body meant that they were positioned in a totally arbitrary social hierarchy of power. Now, such forms of discrimination, I hope it goes without saying, are not based on any kind of inherently essential trait. There's something biological about them. It's based on social constructs that humans built and perpetuated. And that means that we can dismantle and remake them if we choose to. Asymmetries of power in this arbitrary social hierarchy means that a person like me, who's born into a white body, are accorded certain assumptions and positive normative judgments that are not assumed for others. For example, to be allowed to move freely without suspicion. You watch how many people on Neighborhood Watch fora of Facebook or WhatsApp immediately report a brown person moving down the street, but would never report a white person. To be accorded respect without insisting on it. Again, take a friend of color if you are white, and each of you walk into a police station individually, not together, and see how differently you are treated. To be trusted to be truthful by default is another one. It even goes down to arbitrary stuff like going to a cosmetics counter in Dischem and skin tone means a white person's skin tone. Or, going to Dischem and what color are the flesh toned plasters? Well, they're the color of Caucasian skin. So the way that the world positions a particular skin tone as good and normal. These are the power structures that saturate our society. Now, there's an important difference between being mean and being racist that gets lost in a lot of the argument about this stuff. Look, people are mean to each other. All people, all the time. People behave in ways that are unkind and unethical based on all sorts of issues. And all people have the capacity to be unkind, just as they all have the capacity to be kind. That's a universal human condition, irrespective of your racial presentation. So I'd argue the difference between being unkind to someone based on their skin or hair or the outside of the body they've got, which is unethical anyway. I mean, just ask any redhead who got teased at school about being called a ginger or whatever you get called. That's not the same as being racist, which is how power and the threat of violence backs up the act. Let's use the example of Amy Cooper in Central Park, New York. If you don't know what that situation was, do have a look at the video on YouTube about what happened. Okay? Amy Cooper was asked to put her dog on the leash by a bird watcher in Central Park, and she called the police on them. Now, if another white person in a park who's bird watching asked me to put my dog on a leash and I said, I'm calling the cops on you, this would just be such a silly reaction for a request or conflict or argument. Because there's no imminent violence in the act, I would simply say, okay, call the cops. We'll talk when they come. In fact, the cops would probably rock up and see two white women moaning about a dog on a leash, moaning about watching birds, and have a good laugh because it's just silly. But this bird watcher wasn't a white person. This bird watcher was a black person. And calling the cops was underlined with a threat of violence that harkens back to a whole history of violence. That threat is real. As I said, if the cops arrived to find two white ladies fighting about dogs, they'd probably laugh. If they arrived to find a white lady accusing a black man of harassing her, that person would probably get arrested, if not worse. And that's why I'm not entirely convinced that the utterances of Andile Mkatama or Julius Malema are necessarily racist in the way that some might have us believe. Their statements are provocative, maybe even outright mean. I don't agree with them or like them. I certainly don't think they are ethical. But unlike Afroforum would have us believe, there is little to no robust evidence that there is systematic prejudice and violence against white people for being white in South Africa. The statistics on farm murders indicate clearly that proportionally black farmers are targeted as much as white ones. Statistics on crime indicate that there is no specific targeting of white people for any form of robbery, attack, or aggression. Black people are just as victimized by crime. Despite affirmative action laws, white people are still more likely to be employed. And so it's not about a perceived threat or an inflated threat or a fictitious threat of violence. It has to be a credible threat of violence and dehumanization, borne out by evidence and history that differentiates between racial aggression and just plain unpleasantness. I think this again illustrates the importance of historical awareness, sociological imagination, and an intellectual rigor when it comes to considering ethics. Experience alone could lead any of us to believe that we are victims, that we are discriminated against, because no one has gone through life encountering no form of unkindness or unpleasantness. None of us. So while some might believe there is a threat of violence behind certain utterances, that threat needs to be backed up by evidence if it's going to be considered credible. And unfortunately, historically, threats by white people against black people, such as Amy Cooper's, are borne out with evidence in ways that Steve Hofmeyer's are not. Okay, so where are the ethics? We know that the law says now that racial and ethnic prejudice is wrong. That wasn't always the case. So we can't just recourse to the law, although I'd argue at the moment we do have some of the most ethical laws that we've ever had. It comes back again to the principle of allowing other human beings to fully flourish, to be their authentic selves, even when they are different from ourselves. If we refer back to session 3 and the Christie paper, you may recall I argued that the ethics of care means not reducing another person to who we think they are. How to deploy the ethical imagination regarding racial and ethnic discrimination. Intellectual rigor means that we must learn and inform ourselves about past and present instances of bias and discrimination, so to develop historical awareness. That we must hold subtleties and complexities present when understanding the relation between our own personal troubles and particular social issues, for example, sociological imagination. Everyone experiences personal troubles. Some experience far more than their share because of the body that they've been born into. And that's the problem. Public engagement, what Christie calls an ethics of civility, requires realizing that such forms of arbitrary experience premised on bodies, it affects all of us. That when some of us are dehumanized, we all pay a price. As I mentioned, such experiences are shaped by systems that are made and sustained by people, and that means that we can remake them and build something better. Finally, an ethics of care means valuing and protecting the full humanity of the person in front of me, irrespective of the body they were born into, and irrespective of whether I fully and completely understand them. Now, that last one for me as a white person I find particularly interesting. I'm again going to riff off Bister's argument about differentiating between accountability and responsibility. And I would argue that a sociological awareness and intellectual rigor mean that I need to grapple seriously and with good intent what it has meant that I was raised in and grew up in a world that was bent towards me, how that might affect how I view the world and other people in it, how it might indeed affect how I make decisions today. So I find it helpful to differentiate in this particular instance between what I call responsibility and culpability. So responsibility is about being aware of my position, that I was raised in a particular world in a particular way, the history behind it, and to notice how that plays out in my actions and behavior with others. It means I mustn't assume that being well-intended is enough to ensure that I act ethically. I must be constantly vigilant because I am also a product of my social upbringing. As Levinas and Bauman argued, I must suspend the self and pay attention to the other as a whole human being. And so if the other, particularly a person of color or a black person, is saying that I'm doing something a little bit off, I need to listen to them. Take what they're saying seriously, because it's very possible, given how I was raised, that I have an enormous blind spot. But culpability, on the other hand, is about actually being guilty of an explicitly racist act, dehumanizing someone else on the basis of their race. That's Penny Sparrow, that's Adam Katsavelos, that's Vicky Momberg, that's culpability. Now, you see, I think we conflate these two. And like the accountability responsibility discussion from session 4, when we collapse one into the other, we lose something very important. And so we need to be able to distinguish between being responsible and being culpable, and that being called to be responsible is not the same as being accused of being culpable. If we do fold those into each other and treat them the same, we lose a nuance to talk about the role of the powerful in building a more fair and ethical world without constantly being defensive about it. So like Bister's responsibility, I think it's a difficult path. I think it's a fragile hope, but it offers a better approach for moving forward than either defensiveness, assuming everyone is accusing me of being a racist all the time, or denial, as if everything I ever do could never ever be racist at all. Given my upbringing, that's highly unlikely. Now, I think it goes without saying that ideas of understanding racial and ethnic bias are part and parcel of a teacher's ethical imagination towards all their students. So even, for example, a white teacher teaching a class with only white students. must consider what an ethical imagination means for their work in the broader world and how they are raising those children to see the world and their relation to it. So, for example, given that only 9% of South Africans are white, don't you think an important starting question might be where's everybody else? Why aren't they here with us? How have we managed to create such an homogenous group? And I'm sorry to say it, but it's not just schools with heterogeneous racial profiles that experience racism. Schools that only serve black students are not immune from it either. I could not believe the racist terms and epithets that my own students used about themselves and each other, even when they shared a racial and ethnic identity. Black people are not immune from thinking about black people in deficit or dehumanizing terms. It's exactly what Stephen Biko was getting at. So the types of conversations that we hear about in the media in the posh schools such as Bishop's would have us believe these issues are endemic to only upper class rich schools. It's not the case. Ethical imagination, then, when deployed to think about our students, the bodies they were born into, who can judge or hurt those bodies, brings up issues that are ubiquitous in every school. Beyond what the code or the constitution, beyond what socialization or the crowd tell us to do, we need to consider how our actions fundamentally affect the way our students can become, in whatever body they have, a full human being. A cheeky side foray, and some of the issues I've discussed in this section throw up some interesting questions about school uniform. We are already aware of how normative things like hair policy and how judgmental they can be, especially towards issue of gender and race. The regulations read gender non-conforming students cited earlier recommend gender-neutral uniforms. But what about uniforms at all? Some argue they are useful for creating a sense of cohesion in a school community. Others argue they are useful for reducing the effects of class differences. For example, wealth, to stop poorer students feeling ashamed and from wealthy students from flaunting their cash. But I think, from my own personal perspective and experience, that uniforms tend to be more about control than about cohesion. I can't begin to tell you how much of my teaching career I have wasted chasing silly uniform infractions instead of focusing on the important stuff: care, knowledge, thinking, and learning, and being together. Rather than paper over class differences, which I promise you the children know. They know it by the phones that their friends carry. They know it by the earrings they wear. They know it by the cars their parents do or don't drive. Instead of trying to create a false sense of cohesion, perhaps we should have a serious conversation about why some have so much and others have so little. Perhaps instead of creating a false sense of uniformity, we should establish a deep sense of trust and belonging through kindness and relationships. And it would save teachers a heck of a lot of time in policing bodies unnecessarily, to the detriment of good relationships with their students. Besides, there are plenty of schools without a uniform where the students learn just fine. I think uniforms are about tradition and control more than anything else. That's my own take on it. What do you think? Right, we've covered a lot of ground in this session. We've looked at corporal punishment and the student's right to bodily autonomy. We've looked at LGBTQ plus students and how to ethically make space for them in school. We've talked about issues of discrimination based on bodies, mostly around race and ethnicity, and what ethical imagination might compel us to do beyond adhering to the Constitution, as well as how we can reflect on our own position in terms of power in historical and contemporary context. And I ended with a cheeky question about school uniform and whether that should belong in a discussion about ethics education in the body. Our next session is our last one. We'll be looking at ethics education and technology. I'll see you next time.